To say a lot. Here. Good morning. House Transportation Committee is back for our second portion of the morning here on January 15th. And we're now going to be working with Damian Leonard, Ledge Council Office, continuing to try to bring the committee up to speed on kind of the overall structure of how transportation law works in Vermont. Damian, it's all yours.
Great. Morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. So I'm going to ask Jenna to make me a co-host at the meeting, and then I can share my screen. And I'll take you through a presentation I've put together for this morning. It is very similar to presentations that my predecessor would do at the beginning of each biennium. So for those of you who have been here for a few years, some of this is going to be very old information. For those of you who are new, hopefully it'll be helpful. We're going to talk a little bit about how to read a bill. And we're going to talk a little bit about where to find information on past bills. Can't really talk about this year's transportation program because it's not out yet, or this year's motor vehicle bill. But I'll get you the basis of legal principles and also how we look at things when we're looking at federal law versus state law and what we can and can't do. Feel free to stop me with questions. I know we're a little tight on time for lunch, so I'm going to try to move quickly. But if something I'm saying isn't clear, just stop me with a question and have the chair call on you, and we can go from there. So without further ado, me go ahead and share. And I'm going to go ahead and see. There we go. All right. So first thing I'm going to talk about are just what are the forms of law we're looking at. And then I'm going to give us a little bit of a background on sort of key legal principles that we're going to be returning to over and over and over again during the session. I'll do an overview of the transportation and miscellaneous motor vehicle bills. I'll talk a little bit about the drafting process and what my role is in that process. And then finally, if we have time, I'll talk about how to find certain resources on our website. I'm thinking that we probably won't have time to get to that, but I'm also happy to help any of you out with that on a break during committee at any time. So that's one of the things that we can do. So first thing you're going to hear us talk about, for those of you who are new, statutory law and session law. The statutory law is in what we call the green books, which are up over there because they're green. It's also known as the Vermont Statutes Annotated. It's also in something called the white books, which are, a white book is the collection of the laws from each year. So every single year that the legislature's been in session has a white book, although you go back far enough, the bindings aren't white. Then within the white books are the acts that were enacted that year, all of the resolutions that passed, and information about what happened on the floor. There are also the House journals and the Senate journals, which break out that information too, but with the focus on what actually happened. Statutory or codified law, that's the green books. That's what's put in there and it's kept there. There's also session law, which is law that just appears in the white books. It's in an act that's passed. It doesn't get codified. The tricky thing with session law is it's great for something short term. So something that has like a 1-year effect, like a study committee or an intent piece when you're talking about enacting something new. It is not good for a long-term program. So when I started in this job, I had the liquor and lottery portfolio, and a number of the laws governing how the state liquor stores operated were in session law from the early 80s. So you can imagine how hard it was to actually figure out where they were and how to amend them when we needed to update the operating rules for the state agency liquor stores. So that's why we only want to use session law really limited. Resolutions, on the floor. Occasionally committees get a policy resolution. We probably won't see many of them in the transportation committee, but you might. Replacement volumes, if you hear me talking about that, that's just when the supplement, which is we have these little packets of pages that go in the back of the green books. When they get too thick to fit behind the text, we replace the whole volume. And that's a big process. We just did that for Title 23 this year, which is the motor vehicle title. And then statutory revision is this process over the summer where my colleagues and I go through everything you passed and we check it over again for any spelling or grammatical errors. And then we also make sure the publisher of those books, Lexis, gets it right when they put it in there. And you won't believe how hard it is to get that document you put in there into the law sometimes. There have been, and this is what happens when you have hundreds of pages of new laws and folks who haven't worked on it trying to integrate it in. And occasionally you might lose a whole section. And this year we lost dozens of sections, and everything that was amended in 2023 and amended again in 2024, the 2023 amendments disappeared because of a software error. So that's why we do it. So that's what happens there. When we talk about legislative history, if you look online, you'll see at the end of each section, there's this long collection of dates and act numbers. That's your legislative history. When you go into those, you can kind of see what the legislature wanted to do over time. And then you can build that up with floor journals, et cetera. So great example of that is the minimum wage. Dozens of updates over the years. And if you go back to the initial one, you'll realize that the Senate committee that reported the minimum wage out on the floor reported it out with a recommendation that it should not pass. But then the Senate passed it anyway, and Vermont adopted a minimum wage. So that'll tell you something about the politics that were in the building at the time. Session law and codified law, I talked about how session law is hard to find. They're also cited differently. So you'll see when I'm citing to a session law, I'll say 2020 acts and resolves number 123, section blank. When I'm citing codified law, I'll say 23 VSA, which is the title in the green books, and then section number 123 or whatever it is. So that just gives you an idea. If you see VSA, it's codified. If you see acts and resolves, it's likely not codified.
So just on the green books, because you can access them.
Yes.
Which one should we be most comfortable with as far as what is the most up to date?
So the easiest to find the most up-to-date law on is the website.
Okay.
The tricky thing with the green books is that you have to know to check the supplement to make sure the law, that section hasn't been amended. So if you just page to section 123 in the green book, it might have been amended since the green book was published. So then you have to check the supplement. If you want to find out about has the court had any cases on this, then the green book is your better source, because that will have little blurbs from court cases. It will also tell you what we changed every year. So if you want to see how it changed, that's helpful. A lot of times the green book is helpful if you're looking for that really deep granular dive. But if you just want to know the law, the website is way faster and easier.
So I just want to give a shout out to the town clerks in the state of Vermont, because they will have a set of the green books in your town office. If you want to go look in the summer, if you want to look up something, they're there and they will be updated with the little pocket part in the back.
Yeah. And if you need, for legislation you're working on, if you need a more granular deep dive or more detailed history, that's something I can help you with. So we have a collection of session laws, and before the green books, when Vermont used to just be one giant law book, we have those laws going back all the way to the early 1800s at Ledge Council. So we have a pretty good collection there. And then if we need something that we don't have, the state archives have more. So we can get that. So for your purposes in the green books, we're looking at three different titles. 5, which is aeronautics and surface transportation, basically planes and trains. 19, which is highways. So this is how we designate highways, how we maintain highways, how we regulate highways. And then 23, which is motor vehicles, which includes bikes, pedestrians on the highways, ATVs, boats, etc. So anything that's got a motor or interacts with a motorized vehicle is in 23. We might also find ourselves going into things like Title 32, which is taxes, if we're talking about the purchase and use tax for vehicles or something like that. When you're looking at the statutes, you're going to hear me refer to primarily title, chapter, subchapter, section, subsection, and subdivision. I will almost never refer to part. That's kind of an antiquated thing, but this gives you an idea of the way it breaks down. Title's the big piece. Part, some titles are broken into parts where it's a rough grouping of subjects within the title. Then chapter, which is sort of like a specific subject, like operation of motor vehicles, registration, etc. Subchapters, so in operation of motor vehicles, you've got everything from driving under the influence to requirements for getting licensed. So it's wide variety in those subchapters. And then the sections is what we're going to work in the most. Those are the individual portions of the law that we deal with. And within those, there are subsections, which are the larger groupings, and then subdivisions, which is anything smaller than a subsection. I don't mind if you say paragraph A, I'll understand. So don't feel like you have to stick with this. This is just so you understand what I'm saying when I'm talking to you. Here's a look at what it looks like when we're online. So online, you'll get the information about title, chapter, and then the section, and it'll tell you how to cite it if you wanted to do that. Again, if you don't say 23 VSA 4, but you say section 4 of the motor vehicle title, I'll get it. So don't worry. And then these are older versions of the statute, so don't reference these, but they're just for example purposes in here. And gives you a sense of how those sections and subsections will break down, especially on the left-hand side of your screen. No, right-hand side. It's behind me. My gosh. It's been a morning, guys. Okay. Statutory definitions. This is really important, especially in Title 23. 23 VSA, Section 4 are definitions that apply throughout all of Title 23, which, having worked in other titles, is extremely unusual. Most other titles, it's broken out by chapter. So the definitions will apply to the chapter or the subchapter. Having a set of definitions for the entire title is pretty unusual in the VSA. But that's where you go if you want to understand a term. What you will find, though, is that sometimes we have these chapter definitions like the 23 VSA Section 1200 definition, which basically says, and this is for driving under the influence, it says that highway has the same meaning as in subdivision 4 of this, or subdivision 413 of this title, except that for this subchapter, highway does not include a driveway that serves a single family or two family residence. So in other words, when we're talking about operating a vehicle under the influence, if you're simply moving your car around your driveway, you're not operating a vehicle on a highway for purposes of that chapter. As soon as you leave your driveway, you are. And so these are the important things to keep in mind. So one thing I recommend if you're trying to understand things is first look at your chapter or subchapter to see if there are definitions that apply. Sometimes they're even tucked in the section. And then if not, and you don't know what a term means, then go back to 23 VSA 4 for Title 23 and 19, different sections. So, okay. Everybody good on that? I'm trying to move quick because I know we're running out of time. So let's talk about federal law. This is the supreme law of the land. So if the feds say, generally the federal law will prevail over state law, assuming the feds are regulating in that area. And so US Constitution is the very top there. And then below that is federal statute and then federal regulations. So just like our state has a constitution, statutes, and then regulations, the key thing here is this idea of preemption. So a federal law preempts the application of state law in an instance when Congress intended for the federal law to occupy the field or has occupied the field of law there. So there are examples of this. So for example, we have the federal motor carrier laws and rules control over any state laws to the contrary. So we have very limited drug testing permissions for employers in this state. But if you work for a motor carrier, you're subject to the federal drug testing regulations. In other instances, the federal law sets a floor. So it says you can't go below this, but we allow states to adopt a more stringent standard. There's another example here. A federal court that applies to Vermont held that federal railroad law preempts Act 250 and certain municipal laws in Vermont. So basically, municipal zoning and state zoning can't control over federal regulations of railroads. But then there are many areas where federal law doesn't control. Federal law does not set municipal speed limits. That's something that we control through the statutes here. And then the municipalities work within those statutes to set their speed limits and so forth. The other thing is preemption does not enforce itself. So there are unconstitutional laws or laws that are likely preempted that are on the books in this state right now that have just simply never been challenged. A great example of that is, and this law has been changed now, but when I started here, our tax on spirits in the state was clearly unconstitutional on its face because it gave a lower tax rate to Vermont spirits than to spirits out of state, which is, that's a burden on interstate commerce, which is unconstitutional. Vermont was such a small state, though, that the large spirits producers just never challenged the law. We finally changed that law a few years back, but that was one of those things where they raised a ruckus when the law came up, but then they never brought the lawsuit because it wasn't worth their money to bring it to federal court. The other thing you might see are what we call dormant or sleeping laws, where the Supreme Court has held that it's unconstitutional. But when a Supreme Court holds that a law is unconstitutional, it doesn't automatically repeal the law. So sometimes states will say, well, we're not going to change the law. We just won't enforce it, just in case 30 years from now, when the makeup of the Supreme Court changes again, they get a new case and they decide to overrule the prior decision. And suddenly those laws can spring back into force. This came up most recently after Roe v. Wade was overturned. But we have laws on union fees that the Supreme Court has held unconstitutional, which are still on the books. They're just not enforced. And there are likely other instances. That's just what I'm familiar with from my prior work here. So those are important things to keep in mind. You don't have to repeal something because the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. You just can't expect it to be enforced. Okay. Another way the feds will get the state to follow their law or their policy choices is by attaching appropriations to compliance with a federal law or requirement. Interstate speed limits, the seatbelt law. Yep. I think, is there a drinking age requirement too? Anyway, there are a number of these requirements that come out. The whole unemployment insurance system is based on that. The states don't get any federal money. And by the way, the entire administration of it is financed by federal dollars. They don't get any money to administer their unemployment system if they don't comply with all of the federal requirements. So, and so that's something you may run into here as they make changes in policy choices. we may have to scramble to change our law to get funding from the feds or to keep getting funding. Then the final piece is federal court decisions. So the US Supreme Court decisions, those are the supreme law. They override a contrary decision by the state Supreme Court, by the federal appellate courts, provided it's on the same issue. And this is where things can get a little gray. And then always higher court decisions are binding on lower court decisions. So for example, we're in the Second Circuit. So a Second Circuit Court of Appeals decision applying federal law would be binding on Vermont. The key thing to remember, and this comes up a lot in committees, is you hear about another circuit that struck down a law. So for example, the First Circuit down in Boston, they have jurisdiction over Maine, New Hampshire, Mass, Rhode Island, and Puerto Rico. They decide one thing, the Second Circuit hasn't ruled on it. That's only persuasive law. We don't necessarily have to follow that decision until either the Second Circuit or the Supreme Court rules on it. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. State law, just like the federal law, Constitution's the supreme law of the land, then it's the statutory and session laws, then it's the rules adopted by the state agencies. And by the way, you grant the state agencies that rulemaking authority, so they can only adopt rules within the confines of your grant of authority to do that. And you can make that broad or very narrow, depending on what your goals are. And another important thing to note is,
Thank you. On that same topic, rulemaking, the federal government, the Supreme Court just has been changing some of the rulemaking authority of federal agencies. Does that apply to Vermont agencies too, or not?
No. So, so what the federal Supreme Court has been doing, the US Supreme Court has been changing the way historically, you all may have heard this case Chevron mentioned. It basically was a case where, and Chevron's not important. They were just the named party. It's this case where the court held at the time that they would defer to an agency acting within its area of expertise as to whether they were within the confines of the law. They overruled the Chevron deference. So now they look at it basically from the beginning, they give it a fresh look without deferring to the agency to decide if agency rules are within the agency's grant of authority. In Vermont, our law would be decided by the Vermont Supreme Court, and they have not overruled their current position on deference. And so still agencies are assumed their rules are assumed to be within the agency's legal authority and consistent with legislative intent, unless LCAR has objected to the rule. So your Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, their one job is to review the rules as they get proposed to say, is this consistent with the language in the statute? Is it within the agency's authority? Is it consistent with legislative intent? And have they complied with the rulemaking process in general? There are certain things they need to do. If they object on any of those grounds, it doesn't stop the rule from going into effect. But what it means is that if the agency gets challenged or that rule gets challenged, the agency has to prove that they were actually complying with the law and the legislature's intent. Otherwise, it's on the burden is on the challenger to prove that. But we still have deference in Vermont for our state agency rules. I don't know if there are any federal transportation rules that might get called into question over the loss of federal deference or the deference for federal agencies. But that's something that we'll keep track of, and it may affect some of the things that we have to include in bills this session, particularly if rules adopted by the most recent administration or the outgoing administration are challenged under the new administration, and the new administration chooses not to defend them. So that's one of the things that you have too is each time the president changes and their policy priorities change, you end up with an administration that says, I don't like that rule. go ahead and challenge it. We're not going to defend it. And so you may see some things change. I don't know what those would be, but it's something that we'll keep track of for sure. And then finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy is municipal law. So for those of you who don't know, we're a Dillon's rule state. That means that municipalities only have the authority that the state legislature grants them. So we tell municipalities how they can adopt municipal speed limits. They cannot go outside of those confines unless we give them special permission to do so. So that's a good example within your world here. And then this doesn't include common law, which is law made by courts deciding cases and creates a whole sort of confusing cloud over this. So we just talked about rulemaking. Two of your primary rulemaking agencies are the DMV and then the Traffic Committee, who make rules relating to everything from driver's licenses to speed limits. And then, like I said, you have to authorize them to adopt the rules. If there's no authorization, they can't adopt the rules unless they have some sort of broad rulemaking authority that you granted. And then subsequent acts can amend, repeal, or not withstand earlier enacted law as well as rules. So basically, anything you enact cannot bind a future legislature. So you could say the speed limit on all highways in the state shall be 100 miles an hour. Next legislature could come in and say it'll be 20 miles an hour. And there's nothing you can do to prevent them from doing that, except for getting reelected and voting against it. So the other thing too is that there are occasions where a rule that's been adopted by an agency is something that the legislature doesn't like, but it hasn't been challenged in court. And so you may actually adopt a law that just goes ahead and overrules that rule and forces the agency to go back to the drawing board. You can also do that with court cases. So if you don't like the outcome of a court case, you can change the law and say, nope, Vermont Supreme Court, you got it wrong. This is what we mean. And then as long as they're construing and interpreting the law. So you cannot change someone's constitutional rights without changing the Constitution. Yeah. So that's the important thing.
Except the
It's
Constitution.
yeah. Yeah. So you'd have to go through the 4-year process to amend the Constitution if you didn't like a constitutional holding. But yeah, so your lawmaking authority is always limited by the Constitution, both the US and the state constitution. That being said, there's nothing that prevents you from adopting a law that may be unconstitutional. It just may not be enforceable. So this is a debate I had a long time ago when I was a young legislative staffer in the New York State Senate with a state senator. I said, sir, I think this law is unconstitutional. He said, I don't care. That's for the courts to decide. This is what my constituents want. So it went forward. It didn't get enacted, but the bill was introduced. So that's just something to keep in mind. There's nothing that prevents you from doing that. And it happens sometimes without your meaning to do it. The law just gets challenged down the road. Okay. Another thing to keep in mind is you cannot specify how a future General Assembly will appropriate money or allocate funds that are coming in. So one thing you might work on this year is how we fund transportation projects in the state. Next biennium, the legislature could change that. There are a number of sections in law which specify that revenue from such and such fee or tax shall be allocated to this program. And then every single biennium, we not withstand that piece of law and send the money somewhere else. So that's just something to keep in mind. Nothing is permanent, I guess, is the best lesson. You just do your best work for this year and try to set up something that'll work in the future. So common law or case law, this is what we mean, what we refer to when we're talking about court decisions. So before, this dates back to basically medieval England and the Magna Carta. The courts there started creating common law because Parliament wasn't creating a whole lot of laws. So, and a lot of this still applies in people's lives around, for example, if you've been hurt in an accident and how you allocate liability for something that's not covered by insurance. You're going to be suing under common law tort claims. So the other piece is that courts can interpret the law. So something you pass, you may have thought of it, a certain way, and then the court's going to interpret it slightly different than the way you thought about it, because those 5 people sitting down the hill from us see things differently, and particularly in light of the case in front of them, those facts might change their perspective. And maybe it's something you didn't think about here. Maybe it's something you did think about, but it didn't make it into the legislative record that was presented to the court. So they work on what's in front of them. They don't do an independent deep dive. Sometimes that legislative history is pretty much non-existent. Sometimes they get a lot of it. And sometimes they decide they're going to ignore it. So that's something to keep in mind, is that is case law and common law, and it can influence how the statutes that you enact actually get carried out. And then that brings up reacting to that law. So if you think they got their interpretation wrong, you can come back and clarify it. If you really like the interpretation, but it hasn't, maybe it didn't go to the Supreme Court, it was a Superior Court case that wasn't appealed, then you can go ahead and codify the Superior Court's decision in the law and say, this is how we want it going forward. So those are all options. Case annotations are in the green books. They are not complete, and they are picked by a lawyer at Lexis. And so they're not from Vermont. They are not familiar with Vermont. We do not tell them what to put in there. We do provide them with editorial suggestions, but that's about it. Usually I check to make sure that it's actually accurate, the information that's there. But beyond that, they pick it. So that's something to keep in mind. Just read those with a grain of salt. It's just a little blurb from a case, and it doesn't tell you the whole case. If you want to know that, the more recent Supreme Court cases are available on the judiciary's website. I have access to a legal database on Westlaw that can pull cases going way, way back. So if you ever want a case, or you hear about a case from a constituent or something like that, feel free to ask. I'll get you the case, and so you can read it. And then I'm happy to discuss it with you too, if you're curious about what does this mean? How has this been construed? Has this been overruled? That sort of thing. The other thing is the green books include cases from old versions of the statute. So the court may have been construing something we repealed years ago. Okay, let's talk about the T-bill. That always starts in this committee. It is always a committee bill, meaning that it is introduced by this committee instead of sponsored by individual members. The first draft of the bill will be the proposals from the Agency of Transportation that you're going to see in the annual white book. And then I will draft that, and we'll make some modifications to that. Oftentimes the modifications will just be, especially in the early draft, just grammar and style, just to make it consistent with our style. Sometimes we'll include technical corrections. I know the agency has identified, or DMV has identified, some technical corrections this year that'll probably be in the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, which I'll get to in a minute. And then you will modify and add to the proposals and make any changes, and I will make those changes for you in subsequent drafts until we get to the final version that gets introduced. That will have a copy of the transportation program attached to it, and we'll pass that through the House saying this is the transportation program we intend to have adopted for fiscal year 26. And then that'll go to the Senate. They'll do the same thing. And then at the end of the year, depending on how things play out, we'll either come to consensus without going to conference committee, or we'll end up in a conference committee where 3 members of this committee and 3 members of the Senate committee get together to hammer out any differences. So you should get an extra week for crossover. So is everyone familiar with crossover? It's basically the point where House bills have to get out of committee so that they can go to the floor and get sent to the Senate. Same thing happens in the Senate. And it's just to make sure that we get bills across. Money bills always get, or almost always get, the extra week. The Joint Rules Committee agrees on that. And that basically means that you have an extra week from the policy bill deadline to get the transportation bill out. That being said, you're going to want to move it a little sooner than that because it has to go to appropriations and possibly over to Ways and Means as well. Questions? I know I'm moving really fast. I'm sorry, guys. So the way the transportation bill works, and we'll go over this more when we get to the draft, Section 1 always says we're adopting the governor's transportation program except as amended by this bill. It just does it with a lot more words. The next several sections amend the proposed transportation program. And these are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small changes. We're saying, instead of $2.5 million here, we're going to do 2.7. Or we're going to do it from a different funding source or something like that. After that, we get into policy proposals. So we'll have policy proposals from AOT. We'll have, and then amend them in the committee process. Some of them might get dropped out. And then you may also have policy proposals that come to you from other committee members or from other members who have been approached by a constituent with an issue in their district. All of that will get put into the bill and then eventually voted out of this committee. Questions? Okay. Miscellaneous motor vehicle. This one starts across the building in the Senate. And this is DMV's proposals. This is more focused on the motor vehicle title and less. This is not like the whole transportation program, which includes road building and other large transportation policies. This is focused on motor vehicles and other vehicles that are covered in that title. This year, it's likely to have some technical corrections. DMV has identified a number of sections. And because they're also doing their core computer modernization, they've submitted 3 reports now, 2 of which have identified changes necessary to implement the modernization. Some of those have policy implications that you'll want to review and consider. And some of them are just technical fixes that need to happen. And then again, bills that are referred to the committees that relate more to the operation of motor vehicles or licensing may get rolled into that, as well as policy proposals that come from members of the committee. And then one thing you may notice is that sometimes there's a House proposal that really belongs in the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill if you're being, really strict about it, but it ends up in the T bill and vice versa. And that's just logistics of getting what you want into the bill and not relying on the other body. So the PDF here, these links should hopefully work. I've provided links to the bill as introduced, the bill as enacted, the act summary, and the actual transportation program, and then the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill. I noticed that FY21-22 transportation program titles are reversed. I think the links should work, but otherwise, you should have links here. So if you want to go back and look at these bills, and then we have 23 and 24 on the next page. So you can go back and see what was done. This is sometimes helpful, and too, if you want to look back at what was our intent 3 years ago when we started this program, and are we still following that? And does it make sense to go in a different direction if we're doing that now? Some key concepts in the bill. You've heard this before at legislative orientation, but this is just a refresher. This is what we call a reader assistance heading. It's sort of these ellipses on either side and then some text. We put it there just to break up the broad themes of the bill. The next, anything that's underlined, that's new law or new language that we're adding. Anything that's struck through like this is language that is going to be repealed or proposed to be repealed. And then when you see a single ellipses, like you see at the end of the paragraph there, that means that there's a bunch of law after that. We're not making any changes, so we've just omitted it. But it's still good law. And then finally, you'll see little references like this. The CFR refers to the Code of Federal Regulations. You'll see those references a lot because we have to comply with a lot of federal regulations within this, but you may also see references to like the VSA or USC, which is federal law. And so that's just something to keep in mind. When we use those, it's so we don't have to repeat all the language and then update it every single time that regulation or statute changes. Okay, effective dates. So really important to keep track of what your effective dates are. This can affect when programs take effect and when you need to revisit them if it's a pilot. Some things can be effective as soon as on passage. Sometimes you'll see a delayed effective date that's like 3 or 4 years in the future, where we're sunsetting. And by sunsetting, I mean closing down a pilot program. And then what you may also see, and this is much more rare, is a retroactive effective date. That takes some special drafting. We have to not withstand a statute to make something retroactive. And we have to be really careful when we do that, that we're not taking away someone's rights without notice. So, but oftentimes we'll do that. For example, if we give a tax break, we want to make sure everyone who would have been taxed during the year gets the break. So we'll make it retroactive to January 1, something like that. So we had a lot of retroactive effective dates during COVID, and you'll see that too. If there's an emergency that comes up, a lot of times we ask the agencies to start taking action and then say, we're going to bless this when the bill finally passes. And that's something you can do too. For example, with something like Tropical Storm Irene, your chair might be in communication with the secretary and say, okay, we're going to go ahead and bless this transfer of funds when we get to the Budget Adjustment Act. But yeah, use those funds now to make repairs to that bridge that was destabilized or something like that. Sunsets, that's basically what we're talking about, is a repeal of a law that's in the future. So anytime I say sunset, it's usually a pilot program. Sometimes it's something where there isn't broad agreement that it should be the law, but people kind of want to see how it works. And so you agree on a, let's say, 3-year sunset or a 5-year sunset. And then that forces you to come back if you want to keep the law that way. So things that are coming up, automated license plate recognition and automated traffic law enforcement. So there's a work zone traffic camera pilot program that repealed the prospective repeal on automated license plate recognition. So repealed the sunset there, but then it itself makes future changes. And so there's a number of these things that probably in the second year of the biennium, you'll come back to, because we'll have the first report on the pilot program next January. So that program starts this July, and then you'll have 6 months of data next year when you come back. Okay, so there's annual requests for bills. The T-bill is a great example. There's single requests. So say one of your constituents comes to you and says, I've got a great idea to make motor vehicle inspections better. You might want to introduce that law, you might not, or that bill, you might not. But if you do introduce it, that's a single request for a bill. And that it comes once a biennium. It can be taken up anytime. If the law doesn't pass and you want to reintroduce it the next biennium, you have to reach out to us to say, please rerun this bill. And then one of the things to keep in mind when we're doing language is specific language might get your intent across better. But that can often take a lot of time to work out every detail in a bill. And so what happens is you have to find this balance between being specific enough that the agency knows what your intent is and understands it and is going to carry it out, and broad enough that you don't get bogged down, and also that you give the agency enough discretion to figure out the things that in this room we can't figure out because we haven't started running the program. And that's where rulemaking comes in for agencies. But you can't be so broad that you've given away the legislative authority to the agency. Then the courts can get involved and strike down the law. So you have to, it's definitely a balancing act. And then the other question too is, are there a bunch of blanks that you don't know that you want the agency to fill in down the road? So that's another thing that can be done through reports and other things. So really quickly, Logan and I are nonpartisan staff. We serve all of you. We also serve the committee. As a lawyer, it is a really bizarre attorney-client relationship that I have because I have 180 individual clients plus the committees. And ethically, I can't share your confidential information with each other unless you permit me to. So don't assume that you've just, because you've told me something, that your colleague who you're working with knows it, unless you've told me, hey, I'm working with them, you can talk to them about this bill. And I follow the bill through here. So I will draft your T-bill. I will also draft the bill for the member who wants to undo the key provision that the committee loved on the T-bill. And I don't get to make that choice. I have to draft those provisions and do my best job. So we have a drafting manual. People write differently. We have a manual that tries to keep us writing roughly the same. You may get language from a constituent that looks great. You may come up with language that looks great. The agency comes up with language that looks great. Part of my job is to put it into our style, just so it's consistent. It's not that the language is bad. It's just that I have to put it into the style. So anything you send to me, I'm likely to rewrite. Just keep that in mind. And then I'm at time. I'm happy to walk you through finding resources on the website at some point in the future, or individually, everything from reports to old bills, but we don't have time for that today.
Real quick.
Yeah, just very quick. Anthea, who was our previous ledge counsel, she always made a just going through things and a question came up. She always showed us the search. Look, I'm going to go find it right now and go answer that question. And it became each time a little lesson on how to find the information. So that would be helpful.
I'm happy to do that.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to do that for you. Yeah, I'll try not to scroll so I don't hurt anyone's eyes, but I'm happy to take you through that as we go through. And then, like I said, if you have research questions, I'm happy to work with you on those. And I'll either figure out the answer myself or try to find a person either at the agency or NCSL who can get the information, or if it's a fiscal question, I'll direct you to Logan. Great.
David, thank you very much for walking us through the beginning, and we'll have you and Logan in and out of the committee regularly for fiscal and legislative pieces, how that fits into what you can and can't try to work within the law. We are back at 1 o'clock for the commissioner at DMV, so we will want to be pretty